Iran has fired back at the United States' scare tactics by closing off the world's most strategic oil shipping route for the first time since the 1980s. Supreme tyrant Ayatollah Ali Khamenei yesterday threatened to sink US warships in the Persian Gulf in another escalation of tensions amid nuke talks.
Iran has temporarily closed parts of the strategic Strait of Hormuz for several hours, citing security precautions during live-fire military drills. But this move could have serious consequences, which comes at a time that Iranian officials hold their second round of indirect talks with the United States over the nuclear program in Geneva.
Something happened this week, and most people barely noticed. For a few hours, the most important waterway on Earth went quiet. No normal traffic, no routine shipping, just missiles, drills, warships, and a message. A very loud message. On February 17, 2026, Iran did something it hasn't done since the 1980s. They closed the Strait of Hormuz, not with paperwork, not with diplomacy, with live fire, missiles hitting targets inside one of the most important shipping lanes on the planet. And here's the part that should make everyone pause. This happened while Iranian and American diplomats were sitting in Geneva trying to negotiate peace. Yeah, talk about awkward timing, but timing like that is never accidental. It's theater, strategic theater, because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just another stretch of water. It's the artery of the global economy. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's oil moves through that narrow channel. About 13 million barrels. Saudi oil, Iraqi oil, UAE shipments, Qatar gas, everything. Squeezed through a passage only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. And Iran sits right beside it, watching, waiting, controlling. So when Tehran shuts that waterway, even temporarily, the entire planet feels it. Oil traders feel it, shipping companies feel it, governments feel it, and military planners, they definitely feel it. Because this wasn't just a drill. It was a message directed straight at Washington. And the message sounded something like this. Negotiations are happening? Sure, but don't forget who controls the choke point. Now let's slow down for a second. Because the name Iran gave this operation is very revealing. They called it smart control of the Strait of Hormuz. Not protection, not monitoring, control. That one word tells you exactly how Tehran sees the situation. To them, the strait isn't simply international waters, it's leverage, it's insurance, it's a pressure valve they can turn on or off. And during this exercise, Iran showed exactly how they would do it. Missile boats launched strikes. Targets in the waterway were hit. Drones flew missions in jammed signal environments. Moving targets were tracked and destroyed, which tells you something important. This wasn't random training. This was practice. Practice for fighting in electronic warfare conditions. Practice for disabling ships. Practice for closing the strait if war breaks out. And the officer overseeing it all made sure the world understood. From the deck of an Iranian warship, IRGC Navy Commander Alireza Tangsiri said Iran has complete command of the strait. Above the water, below the water, and in the air. That means missiles, submarines, fast attack boats, drone swarms, all ready, all coordinated. Speaking in Tehran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei addressed the growing U.S. military presence in the region. He said American warships are dangerous, yes, but the weapons capable of sending those ships to the bottom of the sea are even more dangerous. That's not subtle diplomacy. That's a direct threat to U.S. aircraft carriers, on camera, to the world. And it didn't stop there. Khamenei went further. He mocked Washington's confidence in its military power. He said even the strongest military can be struck so hard, it may never recover. Now, when leaders talk like that, during negotiations, while missiles are flying in nearby waters, you're no longer watching normal diplomacy. You're watching brinkmanship. High-stakes brinkmanship. And Washington responded in its own way. Because just days earlier, President Donald Trump had delivered a warning of his own. If negotiations fail, he said, it will be a very bad day for Iran. Very bad. Not exactly the language of compromise. So now you have two sides, one threatening military consequence, the other threatening to sink carriers, and both continuing to talk. That's the strange thing about geopolitics. Sometimes the scariest moments are when diplomacy and military escalation happen at the same time. Which brings us to another twist in this story. Because Iran isn't standing alone in these waters, not anymore. While the drills were happening, warships from Russia and China entered the region. Officially, they were participating in joint naval exercises called Maritime Security Belt 2026. This isn't the first time these countries have done drills together. In fact, it's the 8th time. But the timing this year is hard to ignore. Iran closing the strait, America sending more naval power, and suddenly Russian and Chinese vessels show up. Coincidence? Not likely. One of Russia's senior security officials explained it quite openly. He said the goal is to build a multipolar world order at sea. In other words, push back against Western dominance. That's diplomatic language for something much bigger. Because when Russian ships dock in an Iranian naval port, while American carrier groups operate nearby, it creates what military strategists call a tripwire. If conflict breaks out, those ships are suddenly in the middle of it, which means any strike on Iran risks dragging other powers into the situation, and everyone involved knows it. Now let's look at the American side of this chessboard. Right now, the United States has a serious amount of firepower in the region. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is already operating nearby. Several destroyers, support vessels, aircraft. And then came the big move. The USS Gerald Ford, one of the most advanced aircraft carriers ever built, was ordered to head toward the region. Fast. Reports suggest it was already crossing the Atlantic and could arrive within days. 2 carrier groups in one theater is not normal positioning. That's the kind of deployment you see when Washington is preparing for serious contingencies, or preparing to send a message. And that message might simply be, we're ready if this goes south. Because Iran has spent years developing ways to counter large naval forces. Ballistic anti-ship missiles, drone swarms, fast attack boats, electronic warfare, and perhaps the most worrying element, targeting data. Some analysts believe Iran may be receiving satellite tracking support from partners like China. If that's true, it changes the equation dramatically. Aircraft carriers rely heavily on maneuvering and distance for protection. But if an adversary can track them continuously, those advantages shrink. We should remember something. The Strait of Hormuz has been threatened before. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the waterway became a battlefield. Tankers were attacked, mines were laid, insurance rates skyrocketed, and global markets panicked. That was decades ago, before modern missile technology, before today's drone capabilities. So, if a similar scenario happened now, the economic shock could be massive. Some estimates suggest oil prices could jump 15 to 20% almost immediately. That could push prices toward $150 per barrel. Fuel prices spike, inflation surges, supply chains strain. In other words, the ripple effects would spread far beyond the Middle East, and Washington seems to understand that risk. Earlier this week, U.S. maritime authorities issued guidance to American vessels traveling through the strait. The message was simple: stay away from Iranian waters, hug the coast of Oman instead, which is another way of saying things are tense. Very tense, because this isn't just about ships passing each other at sea. It's about what happens if someone miscalculates. One drone too close, one missile misread, one warning shot that escalates. History is full of moments where wars started that way, and here's what makes this moment even more complicated. While all these warships and drills were unfolding, diplomats were still talking. In Geneva, American representatives met with Iran's foreign minister for several hours. Both sides described the meeting as constructive. They even mentioned guiding principles for a possible agreement. That sounds promising on the surface. But then something happened. Shortly after those discussions, Iran's supreme leader rejected a key part of the idea. Specifically, the demand that Iran completely stop enriching uranium. To him, that condition is unacceptable. So now the negotiators appear to be working on a framework. While the ultimate decision maker says no, that disconnect is important, because in Iran's system, final authority doesn't belong to diplomats. It belongs to the supreme leader, and right now, he's not backing down. Meanwhile, Washington is signaling something equally firm. President Trump has openly suggested that regime change in Iran could be the best outcome. That's not exactly reassuring language if you're sitting across the negotiating table. So here we are, Iran demonstrating control over the Strait of Hormuz, Russia and China appearing beside them, the United States reinforcing its naval presence, diplomats trying to prevent disaster, and oil markets watching nervously. The entire situation feels like a high-stakes poker game, everyone holding cards, everyone bluffing a little, everyone hoping the other side folds first. Because if nobody folds, the consequences could be enormous. and the Strait of Hormuz could become the center of the most dangerous confrontation the world has seen in years. But the biggest question is still hanging in the air. Who blinks first? Iran or Washington? And what happens if neither does? That's where this story gets even more complicated. Because behind the naval movements, the speeches, and the negotiations, there's a deeper power struggle unfolding, one that involves Russia, China, and the future balance of power in the world. And this is only just beginning. The economy. Because every military move in the Gulf immediately sends signals through global markets, and traders have very sensitive nerves. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just strategically important, it's economically critical. Remember that number from earlier. Roughly 1/3 of the world's seaborne oil passes through that narrow corridor. Imagine closing a highway that carries 1/3 of the world's food supply. Even temporarily, the shock alone can move prices. And that's exactly what analysts fear could happen if tensions keep escalating. Insurance costs for shipping would jump overnight. Energy markets would react instantly. Oil traders don't wait for missiles to start flying. They respond to risk, which means even the threat of disruption can send prices climbing. Some projections suggest oil could spike to around $150 per barrel if the strait were shut down for a prolonged period. And once oil climbs that high, everything else follows. Transport costs rise, food prices rise, electricity bills increase, inflation spreads. The effects ripple across the entire world economy. That's why governments everywhere are watching the situation very carefully. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional issue, it's global. Tehran insists its program is peaceful. Both sides accuse each other of bad faith. And both sides are building military leverage while talking. It's negotiation with one hand, and pressure with the other, which is why the situation feels so unpredictable right now. One speech can shift expectations. One naval movement can raise alarms. One incident at sea can change everything. And behind all of it, there's a larger geopolitical shift unfolding. Russia and China see opportunity here. An opportunity to challenge US influence. An opportunity to support a partner that stands against Western pressure. And perhaps most importantly, an opportunity to demonstrate that the global balance of power is changing. Not overnight, but gradually. Step by step. Exercise by exercise. Deployment by deployment. That's why analysts say what we're witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a crisis. It's a preview of how future global tensions might unfold. Multiple powers, shared interests, strategic signaling, and the constant risk of escalation. But the real turning point in this story may still be ahead, because while ships gather and speeches grow sharper, one decision in Washington could change everything. A military strike or a diplomatic breakthrough, and the world is waiting to see which path comes first. Because whichever one happens, the consequences will reach far beyond the Persian Gulf, and the clock, quietly, keeps ticking. Both Washington and Tehran believe time is not on their side. Iran believes sanctions and pressure are designed to weaken it. The United States believes Iran is moving too close to nuclear capability. So each side is trying to force the other to back down. And that's where the danger lies, because forcing someone to back down can also push them to escalate. Now think about what the United States is signaling with its military posture. 2 carrier groups moving into range, destroyers, support ships, air wings ready to deploy within minutes. This isn't routine patrol, this is positioning. The kind of positioning that gives decision makers options, military options. And historically, when this level of force gathers in one place, it usually means one of 2 things. Either diplomacy succeeds very quickly, or the window for diplomacy closes. Now look at Iran's side of the board. Closing the strait, even temporarily, was not just symbolic. It was a demonstration, a reminder, a warning. Iran was essentially saying, if we are attacked, the world economy will feel it immediately. And that's not an empty statement. Even a short disruption in the strait could trigger global shockwaves. For decades, the United States has been the dominant military power operating in this region. But now other powers are slowly stepping in. Russia, China, building partnerships, running exercises, testing influence, and Iran sits right at the center of that shift. A country under heavy sanctions, but still strategically important. A country isolated in some ways, but supported in others. And that makes the situation far more complex than it was 20 years ago. If a conflict erupts today, the ripple effects won't stop at one border. They will spread through alliances, through markets, through politics. So, the real question isn't just whether a deal is possible. The real question is whether both sides can step back before events move beyond their control. And that's what the next few weeks may reveal. Will diplomacy survive the pressure, or will the pressure break diplomacy? Right now, nobody knows. But one thing is certain. When Iran temporarily shut the Strait of Hormuz this week, the world got a glimpse of how quickly the balance of global stability can shift. A few missiles, a few warships, a few hours of disruption, and suddenly, every government, every market, every military command center was paying attention. Because if that shutdown had lasted longer, the consequences would have been enormous. And everyone knows it, which is exactly why this story is far from over. In fact, it may only be beginning. Do you think this situation is heading toward a diplomatic breakthrough? Or are we moving closer to a military confrontation that could shake the global economy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you found this analysis helpful, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. And stay with us, because the next developments in this story could change everything.